Hi, my name's Ian Cook. Dr. Ian Cook. I have a PhD. I'm a political scientist relying on climate scientists, which I did for a book I wrote called The Politics of the Final 100 Years of Humanity, 2030 to 2130. And you probably already heard all this because this is like the fourth in the series of videos I'm making. But anyway, let's just keep moving. So as I say, this is about the politics of the final 100 years of humanity, 2030 to 2130. I want to talk in this video about the third chapter of my book, which was entitled Ideology and Inevitability. And in general, it was just about the mental obstacles, the difficulty associated with, to some extent, getting our heads around, understanding, committing collectively to the sorts of radical change necessary to address catastrophic human-caused environment change. So ideology is about ideas, and it's about how ideas sort of affect our capacities to act, and how it's ideas and our abilities to think about this problem, amongst other things that are affecting our capacity to act collectively. But it's also the case that some people think differently about than other people. So that those people of religious persuasions have a different view to some extent from others, and people in what we refer to these days as the global south, in less developed countries, they have a different view. We can't assume they see the problem the same way that we do. And so this is what I want to talk about in this video, just all the intellectual, mental, conceptual, ideological obstacles that are preventing radical change from being introduced. I mean, political systems have, political institutions have real limits in terms of what they can produce, only under conditions under which they're under extreme pressure. That is, if they're not put on sufficient pressure that they have to change, because if they don't change, they lose power. That's the only conditions under which you're going to get anything like radical change, which rarely ever happens. Mostly you get revolution, someone has to come in from outside. So, there's a constraint, and one of the constraints is that there's insufficient demand. And it's that I want to address in this video. Before I go further though, I need to acknowledge that this was, is, and always will be Aboriginal land. Okay, so in this video, as I've said, I outline ideological factors, 7 in fact ideological factors that I've sort of relied on to sort of argue that, well, diverting from this track is almost impossible. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm just saying it's almost impossible. There seems to have an inevitability about it, and I want to explain why I think that in this video. There's some of the views I'm expressing in this in particular are relatively controversial. They're my own, not just my own. There are others who share them, but they are, more, I guess, controversial interpretations and responses. There's criticism of capitalism that you may not like, that you're going to hear. All the views I'm expressing in this video and the other videos, and the things I've written for Medium, because I've written a couple of pieces about my book for Medium. All the ideas expressed there are my own. My responsibility, no one else's. So here we are then, looking at the ideology and inevitability as as our crucial factors. And here we're thinking about the sorts of, as I say, intellectual, mental things that impede action, and conservatism. A basic sort of resistance to change on at least some people's parts. And if you've seen the preceding video, the Oh My God video, I talked about the sorts of things that I was being told needed to be done to address catastrophic human-caused environment change. And I could see how difficult this would be for many people. I could see how problematic the sorts of changes necessary. To some extent, older people in particular tend to get more conservative, or people get more conservative as they get older. So there are there are certain factors that are going to make it very difficult, and the sorts of changes necessary. That is part of the reason why I think how old you are is sort of important. because if my age, there's going to be big change, as it were, if we were going to address catastrophic human-caused environment change. And so I'd have massive. But if I lived, if I was born, when my daughter's born in 2001, then I'd be looking at catastrophe well beyond the time which we hit the 4 degrees, and so there's massive turmoil and massive change, and so there's a major change heading. I'm not going to experience that. So my view of the radicalness of change and the necessity of change, and to some extent the consequences and the cost of change, what will be different from someone else. So we've got there's a conservatism, particularly amongst older voters, and the sorts of changes they will need to vote for are ones they probably aren't able to vote for because they're sort of inherent conservatism. It's not just older people. As I say, they do tend to become more. We tend to become more conservative as we get older. But there are young conservative people for whom this is too much change, and the level of change is sort of probably too much for almost everybody. So we're all challenged. The next factor I want to look at, this one and the next one are hard for me to distinguish. Scope. With respect to scope, I'm thinking of the difficulty of understanding the project of averting this trajectory toward the final 100 years of humanity, and all the different elements that combine into this picture, and the various different things that need to be done. And when I was going through the list in the preceding video, in the oh my God moment, this was trying to understand what that would look like, and it became incredibly difficult. And so, I found a piece by Cameron Brick and Sander van der Linden called "Yawning at the Apocalypse," and they just wrote, "It's very difficult for humans to grasp threats that are invisible, gradual, distributed, and long-term." And so this is, they're basically saying, this is a really difficult problem for us to get our heads around, and a significant amount of work and effort and leadership would be required for us to do that. Abstract and invisible threats aren't terrifying to brains that evolved to solve local, experiential, and imminent problems. And so, what the authors are suggesting here is that our brains just aren't organised, or haven't been organised in the evolutionary process. Because I think this is reflecting evolutionary psychology, where they're saying, well, our brains haven't adapted in such a way that we can even get this problem. And certainly I get that, I understand that. And that's related to the next one I want to talk about, which is scale. And this is the problem that there's just too much to do. Where do you start? What do you start with? How do you start? And there's debates about, are we, should we be pushing wind and tidal power, hydroelectricity but hydroelectricity in the context of changing waterfall patterns, rainfall patterns, complicated. Where do you start? What do you do? Should we be building greenhouses to protect things? Should we be, as I say, the lists are reasonably significant. And once again, as I say, I had a bit of trouble distinguishing. I think there's a difference between scope and scale. Maybe they're just two sides of the same thing. But in a piece by David Fahrenhold called "We're Not So Good at Long-Term Global Problems," he wrote that a global problem with no obvious villains and no one-step solutions, whose worst effects befall somebody else at some other time. If someone set out to draw up a problem that people would not care about, it would look exactly like climate change. And I think there's a bit of validity. I think there's validity to this. Otherwise, I wouldn't be quoting it, would I? It makes sense to me that this is the problem. This is the level of problem we're dealing with. We're dealing with the problem in thinking about a problem. We're dealing with the problem in acting toward resolving the problem, let alone actually dealing with the problem. Yet another factor for me behind the sorts of what I see as inevitability. This is, I'm not saying not to have any hope. I'm just saying here's why I don't have a lot of hope. And this is very much one of my more controversial positions. I think that one of the factors here is selfish individualism. That one of the reasons that nobody's going to act is because it's not good for me, and that's true for me. The sorts of changes that will be necessary would disrupt my life quite radically. Okay, that's not good for me, and I'll be dead before the reality of this hits. I might make it to 2030. I doubt I'll make it too much further than that. So I'm not going to deal with any of the consequences. So from my perspective, in particular, and for people of my generation, older people, this is why I do come back to age being a significant part of our conversation, and recognition that our different ages do affect how we converse, how we engage around this. But it's no good for me, I think, as a dominant position. I think that's what most people, maybe most people in Western societies, Sue Gerhardt wrote a book called The Selfish Society, How We All Forgot to Love One Another and Made Money Instead. And it's, there's a sort of Western, the critique of Western society. But what I looked into in the book was how Western values tend to spread and have tended to spread. And so we're getting selfish individualism not just in Western societies, but more broadly. But anyway, here we go. Well, and maybe this is just about me and people like me who live in the global north, as we refer to it, the industrialised, advanced, even though we don't really know what advanced means, country. So maybe it's just us, but our views are spreading, our values are spreading. Our entertainment industry has made sure that our values are spreading. Anyway, so The Selfish Society, Gerhard wrote about an impoverished emotional culture, the end product of decades of individualism and consumerism, which have eroded our social bonds. And those social bonds are crucial for collective action. Without that sense of, of it being for our good, not my good. But that we have to change that calculation, because as I say, for people like me, acting to address a catastrophic human-caused environment change is not good. So Gerhardt's saying, look, we develop this culture as a result of the ways that we live our lives, and our connectedness to other people, our connection with other people has declined. And acting to avert catastrophic human-caused environment change is very much about protecting future generations and younger people, and promoting their interests over the interests of older people. But old people are like this. They've eroded social bonds, and they are in a selfish society which sustains individualism, greed, and materialism at the expense of collective interests and the needs of the social group as a whole. So this isn't just young people, guys, right now. This is everybody, and particularly, I argue, people in 40s, 50s, and above. Most of those of us who've had pretty good economic conditions to live our lives under, we've done pretty well, and we've developed these sort of it's okay if it's okay for me sort of mentalities, and this is spread, and our abilities, as I was saying, to connect to collective interests and the interests of future generations. I mean, this is hard to imagine in a society where these sorts of values dominate. So, I mean, this is me being a political scientist. Sorry about that. But Adam Smith, I talked about Machiavelli and Hobbes. I could have added Smith and the classical economists as the key influences on the development of political science. So, this way of seeing the world and seeing people, comes to some extent out of economics, but it has really significant political implications. Anyway, I'll get my political science nerdy thing out of the way. Adam Smith could not have imagined the extent to which his concept of homo economicus, economic man, and there's a sort of masculinity to it. So, man, I think, might be appropriate in this circumstance. That perhaps we do need a sexist referent. His concept of homo economicus driven by self-interest in his business dealings, would come to stand for the whole of human nature and convince many people that a selfish way of life is the only way of life. And I agree with Gao. I think in our societies, many people believe that a selfish way of life is the way of life, the only way of life. And under those sort of circumstances, acting to address catastrophic human-caused environment change seems highly unlikely. There's, as part of it, I guess, Gerhard's already been, talking about this to some extent, but I think, consumerism is a really powerful factor here, because I quite like this one, stopping shopping. I mean, that's what it involves, stopping shopping. We've got to reduce the amounts we consume. Part of the problem. And this is something I want to come back to, or will come back to different places, particularly in the final video. This is a lifestyle problem. It's not, it's easy to see it as a population problem. I saw it as a population problem for a long time, but it's a lifestyle problem. And part of it is this, the shopping, the way shopping has become an essential part of our lifestyle. And the idea of stopping shopping is laughable. And it's because our economies rely on it, and it's not just about the fact we like to shop. We're also encouraged to shop, we're encouraged to spend, we're encouraged to stimulate the economy. People need us to shop for profits to be made. So it's more than just our habits, but our habits are, I think, really important. And Martin Xavier's book, Subjectivity of the Unconscious and Consumerism, has a passage in there that just helps me to sort of explain what I'm saying here. In our global culture, being a consumer is what ultimately defines us. We are as we consume. Not so much what we consume, but as we consume, how we consume. These are the sort of crucial factors. What is part of that story, but not necessarily the central part. Branding becoming significant, just having something to consume. Anyway, in our global culture, being a consumer is what ultimately defines us. Consumption is the main definer of our culture, the chief basis of the social order. That's when I was talking about capitalism and the needs for profitability, and the fact that things break down and people aren't shopping. So it's not just a sort of gratification problem, although it is certainly a gratification problem. Consumption is the main definer of our culture, the chief basis of the social order. We all become creatures defined by the age of consumption. Our sense of self is our sense of self as consumer, our sense of self as shopper, and then I come across this sort of stuff, and it's not just here. I found it starts more in management journals, but it's starting to move into psychology journals where people are talking about retail therapy, and talking about retail therapy sort of meaningfully, as it were, as a way of addressing stress. So we have a piece by Carolyn Grigor in the Huffington Post, where she writes that retail therapy, 1 in 3 recently stressed Americans shops to deal with anxiety. And I don't think this is just an American phenomenon. Okay, I'll be pretty happy if you apply that strategy, apply that sort of statistic to Australia. And I think there are many other countries for whom that will be true. Increasing numbers of countries, increasing numbers of people, for whom the very idea that shopping is a way of addressing stress and consuming as a way of returning to sort of normalcy or mental stability. And if that's what we need it for, how can we stop? The next one, now this isn't my word, I would have liked it to be, but it's not. Apocalypticism. This doesn't apply to everybody. Okay, this is, as you might imagine, associated with sort of theological religious positions. And the point here is it's just for some people, catastrophic human-caused environment change isn't the same sort of problem it is for the rest of us. So that if for some people, I think I'll apology to Drake here, for some people, it's God's plan. And interfering with it would be acting against God's will. And according at least to Phil Torres, and in his article in Skeptic called Apocalypticism, how emerging technologies, population growth, it's not a population problem, it's a lifestyle problem, and global warming will fuel apocalyptic terrorism in the future. In that article, he wrote that convictions at the end is nigh are widespread in both the Christian and Islamic communities. And that was certainly what I did some research. In the book, I did some research, read up on and looked into it. It's not necessarily widespread in either of faiths, but it is present in both. So at least some people, and for at least some people, catastrophic human-caused environment change isn't quite the same problem as it is for the rest of us. And that will affect our capacity to collectively act, to address the problem as we perceive it. And a factor that certainly doesn't apply to everybody is post-colonialism. This is about about former colonies and the attitudes of people in former colonies. Pretty much the whole world's colonised by one or other Western power at one stage or other. There are a few major areas. China's obviously one of the countries that escaped it, but for the most part, significant colonisation processes from the 17th through to the 20th century. And those, we went through a decolonisation process in the 50s and 60s, but there are people who remember colonial history, and they people in the global south who see themselves as being exploited by, perhaps some of the victims of people in the global north. Okay, so for them, or for at least some of them, this is a white man's problem. I mean, I'm relying on the concept of white man's burden, but it's the whole idea. This is in a sense, it's a global north problem. Okay, but white men have tended to dominate politics and society in the global north, so it makes sense to some extent to use the concept of white man's problem as they play on the notion of white man's burden. It's a white man's burden. It's something you should be carrying. It's something you should be dealing with. Can I introduce you to Kin Kong? Kin, she works at the Marxist Research Centre for Civic Morality and Social Construction at the Chongqing Normal University. She was kind enough to send me that photo. She's relatively early on in her career, I think. But so she's written a piece. The piece came out this year that she wrote. I'm interested in another piece she wrote in 2018, sorry, 2019, called Justice of Climate Change Governance in the Changing World. Discussion based on North-South relations. This is the global North, global South mentality. I'm just using Kin as just a person who's expressed these sorts of ideas. She's not alone. There's a couple other people I'll talk about soon. But she's just an illustration, an example of the sort of thinking that I expect on the parts of significant numbers of people in the global South. And Kin wrote, "The rich life of people in developed countries is based on high greenhouse gas emissions, on the high greenhouse gas emissions of their forefathers. So it is necessary for them to pay for it." The greenhouse effect is a result of the accumulation of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and that accumulation has been driven by countries of the global north. And so our lifestyles are a function of our forebears and the high consumption, high emission lifestyles that they led. So she says it's necessary for them to pay for it. She says it's unfair for those still at the stage of solving the problem of food and clothing to pay for the past actions of those who have already led a higher quality of life. Unfair for those still at the stage of solving the problem of food and clothing. Pay for the past actions. It makes sense. Hard to argue against that position. Seems a legitimate one. And it's not just hers. This is an edited collection called The Handbook of Climate Change in India by Navroz Duaj. I'm particularly interested in a piece, Global Warming in an Unequal World, a case of environmental colonialism, written by Agarwal and Naray. A case of environmental colonialism. So what they're arguing is that the greenhouse gas conversation debate has been skewed in such a way that it's serving the interests of people in the global north, and it's still part of a colonisation process. And and some of the some arguments have been put forward that we've moved into a sort of a tacit. There's a we don't have formal colonies anymore, but we're still exploiting people in the global south, and so they're seeing it as part of that ongoing agenda. And so they wrote, can we really equate the carbon dioxide contributions of gas-guzzling automobiles in Europe and North America with the methane emissions of draft cattle and rice fields of subsistence farmers in West Bengal or Thailand? And it's a good question. But can we really do that? Does that make sense? Would it make sense if we came from the global south rather than the global north? Assuming that you do come from the global north? It's a good question. And further for them, no effort has been made to sort of separate the survival emissions of the poor from the luxury emissions of the rich. So there's no attempt to sort of calibrate here. And so everybody's emissions are treated exactly the same, no matter what those emissions are about. And so the accounting process, this is what they're complaining about, the accounting process, the ways we're collecting data, the way we're presenting data, is biased in favour of the global north against those in the global south. And, when you stop and think about it, it makes sense. And, and hopefully most of the ideas I put forward in this video have made sense. That, what we're looking at is a sort of mental factors that we're going to have to address or that would need to be overcome. I'm not saying it's impossible, I'm just saying, it's really difficult to imagine that we're not going to have our heads spinning and they're just going to continue to spin on until it's just too late. Anyway, so in this video what I tried to do, or what I hope I did, was to outline 7 ideological, mental, intellectual, conceptual factors that seem to me to be part of the difficulty in addressing catastrophic human-caused environment change and why this trajectory continues and why we're still sort of on it and we're heading toward 2030 and, for me, the final 100 years of humanity. Anyway, that's it for this video. Thanks for watching. Please follow me on YouTube and Medium.